Colorado Territory, 1878, a time when the untamed frontier promised new beginnings for those brave enough to stake their claim. For widowers with children, maintaining a homestead while raising a family proved nearly impossible alone. Many turned to mail-order bride advertisements in Eastern newspapers, hoping for a young woman willing to mother orphaned children and bring feminine comfort to their rugged existence. But what happens when the bride who arrives bears the wisdom of years, rather than the bloom of youth that frontiermen expected? Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from today. And if this story resonates with you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. This is the story of Harriet Collins, a woman who's 39. Years of life experience led 3 potential husbands to send her back east before she could even unpack her trunk. A woman deemed too old for frontier marriage until she met Caleb Thornton, a rancher with 3 wild children whose grief had hardened into a shell around his heart. During the harshest winter the Colorado mountains had seen in decades, these 2 souls, each bearing the marks of time and loss, would discover that sometimes the most nurturing hands are those that have already weathered life's storms, and that true partnership requires the kind of wisdom that only comes with years. Harriet Collins stood on the train platform in Pine Creek, Colorado Territory, her gloved hands clasped tightly around the handle of her worn leather case. The small frontier town looked much as she had expected, dusty, sparse, with a single main street lined with wooden buildings weathered by harsh mountain seasons. Unlike the other passengers who disembarked with excitement or trepidation, Harriet's face remained composed, her posture erect, betraying nothing of the anxiety that fluttered in her chest. At 39, Harriet had long since abandoned the notion of marriage back in Boston. After 15 years as a schoolteacher and then nurse during the war, she had resigned herself to spinsterhood. But when her brother's business failed and she found herself without a home or position, becoming a mail-order bride had seemed a practical solution, a last chance for security, and perhaps, if she was fortunate, companionship in her remaining years. "Miss Collins," a man approached, hat clutched awkwardly in his hands. He was taller than she had imagined, with a thick beard sprinkled with grey and kind, if uncertain, eyes. This was George Simmons, the shopkeeper who had written such promising letters about building a life together in this mountain community. "Mr. Simmons?" Harriet nodded politely, offering her hand, which he took with visible surprise at her firm grip. "I trust the journey finds you well." "Yes, quite well," he replied, his eyes darting over her face and form. She knew what he saw. A woman whose brown hair showed threads of silver at the temples, whose face bore the fine lines of experience around the eyes, whose figure, while still trim, lacked the softness of youth. "You're—" he hesitated. "Older than you expected," Harriet finished for him, having anticipated this reaction. "My letters mentioned I was of mature years, Mr. Simmons." "Yes, of course," he said quickly, though his disappointment was poorly concealed. "I just assumed— Well, no matter. I've arranged a room for you at Mrs. Landry's boarding house. We can be married by Reverend Parker tomorrow, if that suits." "I'd prefer to have a few days to become acquainted, Mr. Simmons," Harriet replied. "Rushing into marriage, even an arranged one, seems unwise, wouldn't you agree?" George cleared his throat. "Of course, very sensible." Their walk to the boarding house was filled with George's nervous chatter about the town, the coming harvest festival, and the merchandise expected on next month's supply train. Harriet asked pointed questions about his shop, the community, and the challenges of mountain life, topics that seemed to both impress and unsettle George, who had perhaps expected more feminine inquiries about household arrangements. The boarding house was clean and modest, run by a widow named Beatrice Landry, whose shrewd eyes took in Harriet's practical travelling dress and composed manner with unconcealed curiosity. "Mr. Simmons' bride-to-be?" Mrs. Landry noted as she showed Harriet to her room. "He's been preparing for your arrival these 2 weeks past. We're taking some time to become better acquainted before proceeding with marriage arrangements," Harriet clarified, setting her case on the simple bed. Mrs. Landry's eyebrows rose slightly. "Sensible," she commented, "though unusual for these. In parts, most male brides are married before the dust of the journey settles from their skirts." That evening, alone in her room, Harriet carefully unpacked her few belongings: practical clothing, a medical kit she had assembled from her nursing days, several cherished books, and a small wooden box containing her mother's cameo. She stood before the small mirror above the washstand, critically assessing her reflection. The journey had left shadows beneath her eyes, and the mountain air had already begun to dry her skin. She was not unattractive, she thought objectively, but neither did she possess the bloom of youth that men like George Simmons clearly sought. "You've faced worse than disappointment, Harriet Collins," she told her reflection firmly. "This is merely the first day." George Simmons called upon her the next morning as promised, taking her on a tour of his general store. Harriet immediately noticed several inefficiencies in his inventory system and the disorganized arrangement of goods. "If you grouped household items together and kept a more detailed ledger, you might better track what sells most frequently," she suggested, already envisioning improvements to the cluttered shop. George's smile faltered. "Most ladies find the fabric section more interesting," he said, attempting to guide her toward bolts of calico and gingham. Harriet followed, though her mind was still calculating potential improvements. "The selection is quite limited. Have you considered stocking more practical materials? Sturdy canvas and wool would serve the miners and ranchers better than decorative prints." That evening, Harriet dined alone at the boarding house, aware of curious glances from other residents. Mrs. Landry eventually joined her, pouring them both cups of strong coffee. "Mr. Simmons seemed a bit flustered when he departed earlier," she remarked. Harriet sighed. "I may have overwhelmed him with suggestions for his business." Mrs. Landry's lips twitched. "George Simmons has been running that store the same way for 15 years. Men like that don't appreciate innovation, especially from a woman they expected to simply admire their accomplishments." "Yes, I'm familiar with the sentiment," Harriet replied, stirring her coffee thoughtfully. "This territory needs practical minds, Miss Collins. Don't let anyone tell you differently, but it might be wise to ease a man like George into your forthright nature. He expected a young, impressionable wife, not a woman of experience with her own ideas." Harriet considered this advice as she sipped her coffee. She had never been particularly skilled at diminishing herself to please others, a trait that had served her well as a nurse, but had proven challenging in personal relationships. Perhaps she should try harder with George. After all, her options, at 39, were decidedly limited. The next 3 days passed in similar fashion. Harriet attempted to show interest in the aspects of mercantile life that George deemed appropriate for a wife, arranging displays, greeting customers with a smile, serving coffee to the men who gathered to exchange news. But inevitably, her practical nature would emerge. She reorganized an entire shelf while George was occupied with a customer. She corrected his arithmetic when he miscalculated a sale. She discussed medical treatments with the local doctor who visited the store, displaying far more knowledge than George thought seemly. On the fourth day, Harriet arrived at the general store to find George unusually solemn. "Miss Collins," he began, ushering her into the small office behind the counter, "I've given our arrangement considerable thought." Harriet already knew what would follow. She had seen the discomfort in his eyes grow with each passing day. "I believe we may not be as compatible as our correspondence suggested," he continued. "You are certainly accomplished and knowledgeable, but I fear you would not be content with the simple life I can offer." "You mean I am not the young, biddable wife you envisioned?" Harriet replied without bitterness, merely stating fact. George had the grace to look embarrassed. "You deserve someone who can appreciate your unique qualities. I've taken the liberty of mentioning your situation to Frederick Wilson. He owns the silver mine outside of town and has been seeking a wife. Perhaps you would be better matched." And so, for the price of a new train ticket he never had to purchase and a sincere apology, George Simmons dissolved their agreement. Harriet found herself redirected to Frederick Wilson's substantial home at the edge of town, where the housekeeper eyed her with unconcealed suspicion. Frederick Wilson proved to be everything George Simmons was not: confident, commanding, and considerably wealthier. His silver mine was the largest employer in the region, and he ran it with ruthless efficiency. He was also nearly 50, a widower of 2 years, whose first wife had been 20 years his junior. Initially, Harriet found his forthright manner refreshing after George's awkward discomfort. "I need a wife who understands business," he told her bluntly during their first dinner together. "Someone who can manage a household while I focus on expansion. Your background as a teacher and nurse suggests intelligence and capability." Harriet allowed herself a flicker of hope. "I would welcome involvement in meaningful work. I've managed schoolrooms and hospital wards efficiently." Frederick's expression cooled slightly. "Involvement? No, Miss Collins. I meant understanding why my business must come first. A wife's duty is to create a comfortable home and receive my business associates appropriately. I employ managers for business concerns." The following days revealed the vast gulf between Frederick's expectations and Harriet's nature. He appreciated her intellect in theory, but became irritated when she questioned his methods after hearing about conditions at the mine from Mrs. Landry. When she suggested improved safety measures that could reduce accidents, his expression darkened. "My men won't take instruction filtered through a woman, Miss Collins. It undermines my authority. But if the suggestion has merit, merit is irrelevant. Perception is everything in business." The final break came when Frederick returned from a business trip to find that Harriet had treated the young son of one of his miners for a severe cough, using remedies she had learned during her nursing years. "You've overstepped significantly," he informed her, his face flushed with anger. "These miners aren't your concern. They have their own ways of handling illness. Your interference makes it appear that I endorse such meddling." "The child needed help," Harriet responded calmly. "His fever was dangerously high." "That's not the point," Frederick snapped. "A wife should complement her husband's position, not create complications in his business relationships." 2 weeks after arriving in Pine Creek, Harriet found herself Once again at Mrs. Landry's boarding house, this time with an invitation to meet Arthur Patterson, the town banker. Mrs. Landry's expression was sympathetic as she welcomed Harriet back. "Mr. Wilson found you too independent," she observed, helping Harriet unpack her trunk for the second time. "Independent is one way to put it," Harriet replied with a small smile, though he used considerably less flattering terms. "Men like Frederick. Wilson want ornaments, not partners," Mrs. Landry remarked. "Arthur Patterson might be different. He's educated, at least." Arthur Patterson was a widower of 48, with meticulously groomed side whiskers and precise habits. Where George had been intimidated and Frederick angered by Harriet's capable nature, Arthur seemed intellectually intrigued. "You've caused quite the stir in our little community, Miss Collins," he remarked over tea in his well-appointed parlour. "2 potential husbands in less than a month. That might be a record for Pine Creek." Harriet appreciated his humour, but remained cautious. "I find that being honest about who I am from the beginning avoids disappointment later, Mr. Patterson. A commendable philosophy. I value honesty myself. My late wife, God rest her soul, was considerably younger and somewhat sheltered. After 3 years alone, I find I miss female companionship, but perhaps someone with more life experience would make a more suitable companion at this stage." This pragmatic approach appealed to Harriet. Perhaps a man who had already experienced marriage would be more accepting of a wife who brought wisdom rather than youth to the relationship. Arthur was undeniably intelligent and cultured by frontier standards. His home contained more books than Harriet had seen since leaving Boston, and he engaged her in stimulating conversation about literature and current events. He didn't flinch when she disagreed with him on political matters or when she displayed knowledge of financial principles. For the first time since arriving in Colorado, Harriet allowed herself to believe she might have found a suitable match. Arthur didn't need her to pretend to be something she wasn't. His established position meant he had nothing to prove, unlike George with his struggling store or Frederick with his empire-building ambitions. Their courtship proceeded smoothly for nearly 2 weeks. Arthur introduced Harriet to the respectable families of Pine Creek, proudly showcasing her knowledge and refinement. Harriet began to envision a life as Mrs. Patterson, managing his household, reading by the fire on winter evenings, perhaps even assisting with some of the bank's correspondence. Then came the dinner party at Judge Morrison's home, where the conversation turned to the territorial governor's recent policies regarding education. Harriet, who had spent 15 years as a teacher, offered her analysis of how the new regulations might affect rural schools and their students. The table fell silent. Arthur's smile remained fixed, but something in his eyes hardened. Later, as they walked back to the boarding house, his manner was noticeably cooler. "You made quite an impression tonight," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "The education issue is fascinating from both practical and philosophical perspectives," Harriet replied. "Judge Morrison seemed interested in my observations." "Yes. Well," Arthur cleared his throat, "in the future perhaps it would be best to let the men handle political discussions. A woman with too many opinions on such matters can make people uncomfortable." Harriet stopped walking. "Are you uncomfortable with my opinions, Mr. Patterson?" Arthur sighed. "I admire your intelligence, Miss Collins, truly, but there's a difference between private intellectual discourse and public display. A banker's wife must be above reproach in all things, including knowing when to speak and when to smile politely, even when the smile conceals valuable insight." The familiar disappointment settled in Harriet's chest. Another man who wanted her mind dimmed to make his shine brighter. "Especially then," Arthur replied, not unkindly. "The world has certain expectations, Miss Collins. Fighting them at every turn only leads to unhappiness." 3 days later, Arthur Patterson regretfully informed Harriet that he didn't believe their temperaments were well suited for marriage. Unlike her previous rejections, he offered no alternative suitor, merely a month's lodging at the boarding house paid in advance to give her time to consider her options. The news spread quickly through Pine Creek. 3 men had found Harriet Collins too old, too opinionated, too experienced altogether for frontier marriage. Mrs. Landry found her sitting alone on the boarding house porch that evening, watching the autumn sunlight paint the distant mountains gold and crimson. "I've received a letter," Mrs. Landry said without preamble, settling into the chair beside Harriet. "From Caleb Thornton. He owns the Circle T Ranch about 20 miles north of here. His foreman was in town last week and heard about your situation." Harriet raised an eyebrow. "Is Mr. Thornton looking for entertainment? The tale of the unwanted mail-order bride must provide quite the amusement." "Caleb Thornton isn't a man who finds amusement in much these days," Mrs. Landry replied soberly. "He lost his wife in childbirth 2 years ago, left him with 3 children, the oldest just 7, the youngest still in swaddling clothes." "How tragic," Harriet murmured, her irritation fading. "He's a good man. Hard, yes, and more focused on his ranch than people since Catherine died." Mrs. Landry paused. "But fair. He needs a wife, not for himself so much as for his children. The housekeeper who's been caring for them is returning east to nurse her ailing sister." Harriet felt a flicker of indignation. "And he thinks I'm desperate enough to accept any offer after 3 rejections?" Mrs. Landry's steady gaze held no judgment. "He thinks a woman with experience raising children might prefer straight talk to pretty words. He offers a marriage of convenience, room, board, and security in exchange for caring for his children and running his household. No false expectations on either side. That's unusually honest. That's Caleb Thornton. He has no patience for pretense anymore." Mrs. Landry handed her the letter. "Read it yourself. He'll send a wagon at the end of the week if you're interested. If not, no hard feelings." Later that night, Harriet read the brief, blunt letter by lamplight. The handwriting was strong and clear, the language direct. "Miss Collins, I have 3 young children who need a mother's care. I can offer a comfortable home, fair treatment, and security. I don't care about your age or what Pine Creek thinks. I need someone who understands children and isn't afraid of hard work or isolation. The children's needs come first, always." As the first leaves of autumn drifted past her window, Harriet Collins considered her dwindling options. Return east, in defeat, to impose on relatives who could barely support themselves, seek employment in a town where her reputation was already established as difficult and unsuitable, or accept this final offer from a grieving rancher who at the very least seemed to value the very qualities others found so objectionable, her maturity and experience. The golden aspen leaves continued to fall, marking the inevitable passage of time. By morning, the mountain world would be a step closer to winter. Perhaps, Harriet thought as she folded the letter, it was time she embraced the season of her life rather than apologizing for it. Not by becoming less, as the others had wanted, but by finding a place where her years might finally be an asset rather than a liability. The wagon that arrived for Harriet at week's end was sturdy and well-maintained, much like the man who drove it. Frank Morgan, the foreman of the Circle T ranch, was a weathered man in his 50s, with kind eyes and a respectful manner. "Miss Collins," he tipped his hat. "Got room for one trunk and whatever else you can fit in that space there." He gestured to a small area behind the seat. "Weather's turning. Best we get moving before the mountain passes grow difficult." The sky hung heavy with the promise of early snow, confirming his assessment. Harriet had packed her belongings with efficiency, prioritizing her books, medical supplies, and practical clothing over the few ornamental items she'd brought from Boston. Mrs. Landry pressed a small package into her hands as they said their goodbyes. "Dried herbs and remedies," she explained, "for the children. Mountain winters bring coughs and fevers." The journey to the Circle T stretched from hours into a day as the weather deteriorated, forcing them to travel at a cautious pace. Frank was a man of few words, answering Harriet's questions with thoughtful responses that offered genuine insight into what awaited her. "What kind of man is Mr. Thornton?" she finally asked directly as they crested a hill that revealed a vast valley. Below, Frank considered this for a long moment. "Fair. Expects hard work because he works harder than anyone. Doesn't suffer fools." He glanced at her. "Hasn't smiled much since Catherine died." Mrs. Landry mentioned he has 3 young children. Emma's 7, clever as a fox. James is 4, full of energy. Little Rose just turned 2, sweet child but fretful without a mother's touch. Frank's voice softened. "They're good children. Just lost, like their father." As the wagon descended into the valley, Harriet caught her first glimpse of the Circle T, a sprawling ranch with a substantial main house, several outbuildings and corrals where cattle and horses moved like dark shadows against the yellowing grass. It was larger than she'd anticipated, suggesting Caleb Thornton's operation was prosperous despite the hardships he'd faced. "He runs one of the finest cattle operations in the territory," Frank volunteered, following her gaze. "Built it from almost nothing after the war. Man knows livestock like some men know their own names." The main house was constructed of solid timber, 2 stories with a wide porch that wrapped around the front. Smoke curled from the chimney, promising warmth within. As Frank brought the wagon to a halt, the front door opened, spilling golden lamplight into the gathering dusk. The woman who emerged was elderly and careworn, with work-roughened hands and a practical apron. "You must be Miss Collins," she said, helping Harriet down from the wagon. "I'm Mrs. Fletcher. Been keeping house here since—" She glanced back at the doorway where a tall figure had appeared. "Since my wife died," the man finished for her, stepping into the light. Caleb Thornton was younger than Harriet had expected, perhaps 35, though grief had carved lines around his eyes that aged him. His dark hair showed no grey, and his frame was powerful from the physical demands of ranch life, but it was his eyes that commanded attention, deep blue and assessing, holding a weariness that came from facing life's hardest blows. "Miss Collins." His voice was a deep baritone, neither warm nor cold. "Welcome to the Circle T." He made no move to take her hand, instead gesturing toward the house. "Mrs. Fletcher's prepared supper. You must be hungry after the journey." Inside, the house was plain but well-maintained, with sturdy furniture and practical touches. The kitchen was warm and fragrant, with the smell of beef stew and fresh bread. What struck Harriet immediately was the absence of any feminine influence. No curtains softened the windows, no ornaments adorned the mantel, as if all traces of Catherine Thornton had been systematically removed. "The children are already abed," Mrs. Fletcher explained, noting Harriet's glance toward the stairs. "They'll meet you at breakfast." "All the more reason to finalize arrangements quickly," Caleb said, serving himself stew. "Miss Collins needs to know what she's agreeing to before winter isolates us." Harriet appreciated his directness. "I've read your letter, Mr. Thornton. You've been admirably clear about your expectations." Reading and seeing are different matters. His gaze met hers directly. "This isn't a place for someone who needs society or comfort. Winters are harsh. Spring brings mud deep enough to swallow a man. Summer's short and demanding. Fall is preparation for doing it all again. And the children—" He paused, something flickering in his expression. "The children need stability. I'm not afraid of hard work or isolation, Mr. Thornton. And I spent 15 years teaching children of all ages before nursing during the war." Something shifted in his expression, not quite approval, but acknowledgement. "Why did the others send you back?" The blunt question might have offended Harriet weeks ago. Now she found his forthrightness refreshing. "I was too old for the first, too opinionated for the second, and too willing to speak my mind in public for the third." Apparently, wisdom and experience are not valued qualities in a frontier wife. Caleb nodded as if this confirmed something. "And what are your expectations, Miss Collins? Every bargain has two sides," Harriet considered carefully. "Respect, not flattery or false courtesy, but basic respect for my intelligence and capability. I don't require affection, but I won't be treated as property or an ornament. And I expect to have authority where the children are concerned. Consistent discipline and education are essential to their well-being." "Fair terms." Caleb set down his spoon. "Here's what I offer. A marriage in name, with separate sleeping quarters. You'll manage the household, which includes cooking, cleaning, and the children's care and education. During busy seasons, everyone works where needed, garden, preserving, even with the cattle if necessary. You'll have a monthly allowance for personal needs, use of the library such as it is, and my name for whatever protection that provides." Mrs. Fletcher watched this exchange with an unreadable expression. "Caleb," she interjected gently, "perhaps Miss Collins would like time to rest before making decisions." "Winter's coming and you're leaving in 3 days," he replied, not unkindly. "Time is a luxury we don't have." That night, in the neat guest room Mrs. Fletcher had prepared, Harriet sat by the window watching the first snowflakes begin to fall across the ranch yard. The honesty of Caleb Thornton's proposal resonated with her practical nature. No false promises or romantic illusions, just straightforward terms for a partnership of convenience. After the disappointments in Pine Creek, such clarity was almost a relief. Yet questions lingered. What kind of life would she build in this remote place, with a man so marked by loss? What sort of mother could she be to 3 children who had already experienced such tragedy? Could a woman approaching 40, who had never had children of her own, truly provide what these young ones needed? Morning brought heavier snowfall, and the realization that decisions couldn't be postponed. Over breakfast, Harriet announced her acceptance of Caleb's terms. "Pastor Williams can't reach us in this weather," he said, glancing out at the thickening snow. "We'll need to formalize things once the road's clear. In the meantime, Mrs. Fletcher will show you the household operations and introduce you to the children." As if summoned by his words, the patter of small feet sounded on the stairs. A girl with dark braids and solemn eyes appeared first, wearing a dress that had clearly been mended multiple times. Behind her came a tow-headed boy, whose untucked shirt and unlaced boots spoke of hasty dressing without supervision. In the boy's arms was a small girl with golden curls and a thumb firmly planted. In her mouth, "Children," Caleb said, his voice softening almost imperceptibly. "This is Miss Collins. She'll be staying with us." The oldest girl assessed Harriet with a gaze remarkably similar to her father's, direct and uncompromising. "Forever?" she asked. "Yes, Emma," Caleb replied. "Miss Collins will be your new mother." Harriet noted he didn't use the word stepmother, a small but significant choice. Emma's expression remained guarded. "She's older than Mama was." Harriet felt the familiar sting of age-based judgment, but before she could respond, Caleb spoke, his tone firm but gentle. "Miss Collins has many years of experience teaching children. She knows stories and history and mathematics. And she knows about medicines too. That's valuable for us, especially in winter." It was the first time he had defended her, and Harriet felt a surprising warmth at his matter-of-fact acknowledgement of what her age truly represented. Not diminished beauty, but accumulated wisdom. The boy, James, seemed less concerned with Harriet's age than with more practical matters. "Can you make apple cake? Mrs. Fletcher makes it sometimes." "I can learn," Harriet replied honestly, "and perhaps you could help me." Only little Rose seemed completely accepting, reaching out chubby arms toward Harriet in a gesture that tugged unexpectedly at her heart. Taking the toddler from her brother's arms felt somehow momentous, as if she were accepting not just the physical weight of the child, but the responsibility for her future happiness. The next 2 days passed in a flurry of activity as Mrs. Fletcher transferred her knowledge of running the Circle T household. Harriet discovered the ranch was largely self-sufficient by necessity. They smoked their own meat, preserved vegetables from a substantial garden, made soap from rendered fat and lye, and maintained an efficient system for everything from laundry to winter storage. Caleb's modernized where he could, Mrs. Fletcher explained, showing Harriet the hand pump that brought water directly into the kitchen sink. He's practical above all else. Harriet rarely saw Caleb during daylight hours. Despite the snow, ranch operations continued. Cattle needed tending, repairs couldn't wait for fair weather, and the small crew of hands who lived in the bunkhouse required management. He returned each evening snow-covered and exhausted, ate quickly, and retreated to his study, where Harriet sometimes heard him moving about late into the night. The children, however, were a constant presence. Emma watched Harriet with suspicious eyes, testing boundaries with small acts of defiance. James followed Harriet everywhere, peppering her with endless questions. Rose, to everyone's surprise, attached herself to Harriet immediately, crying when separated from her new caretaker. On Mrs. Fletcher's final evening, as the women sat mending by the fire after the children were asleep, Harriet finally asked the question that had been forming since her arrival. "Mr. Thornton seems to live only for work. Is there nothing else that brings him joy?" Mrs. Fletcher's hands stilled before the fire. Caleb was different before, laughed easily, sang to the children at bedtime. Catherine could bring a smile to his face just by entering a room. She resumed her stitching. "Now he pours everything into the ranch and providing for the children. I think he's afraid to love them too openly, for fear of losing them too. How did he come to think of taking another wife after such a loss?" "He didn't. It was my idea." Mrs. Fletcher tied off her thread. "My sister's health is failing, and I can't leave these children without proper care. I told him he needed someone, not just any young girl, but someone with experience and strength enough to handle this place, these children, and him. A small smile touched her lips. When Frank came back from town with stories of a mail order, bride too mature for Pine Creek's menfolk, I knew we'd found the right candidate. The morning of Mrs. Fletcher's departure dawned clear and cold. The snow had stopped, leaving a pristine white landscape under a brilliant blue sky. Frank had the wagon ready early, packed with Mrs. Fletcher's trunks and provisions for the journey to the train station in Denver. "The passes should be clear enough," Caleb said, helping the elderly woman into the wagon, his expression unusually soft as he looked at her. "Right when you arrive. Take care of each other," Mrs. Fletcher replied, her gaze moving meaningfully between Caleb and Harriet. "And remember what I said about patience." As the wagon disappeared down the long drive, Harriet felt the weight of responsibility settle fully on her shoulders. She was now effectively mistress of the Circle T, married or not, with a household to run and 3 children to care for. "I've work in the north pasture," Caleb said, already turning toward the barn. "Supper at 6. Left alone with the children, Harriet spent the day establishing a routine. She examined the pantry with its carefully preserved stores, inventoried linens and clothing that needed mending, and assessed the educational needs of the 2 older children. Emma, she discovered, read remarkably well for a 7-year-old, but struggled with numbers. James had boundless energy that needed channeling into purposeful activity. Rose simply needed the consistent presence of a nurturing adult. By late afternoon, Harriet had prepared a hearty stew and bread for the evening meal, helped Emma with her reading, engaged James in sorting buttons by color and size, a task that improved both his counting and his dexterity, and rocked Rose for an afternoon. Naprod Caleb returned as the light was fading, stamping snow from his boots on the porch. He hesitated almost imperceptibly at the threshold, as if struck by the scene that greeted him. A warm kitchen with his children gathered around Harriet as she taught Emma how to set the table properly. "Papa!" James launched himself at his father's legs. "Miss Collins showed me how to count by 2s, and I helped with bread." Caleb's large hand came to rest on his son's head, a fleeting gesture of affection. "That's so." "Wash up for supper, please," Harriet said, noting how both Emma and James looked to their father for confirmation that they should obey. After a moment's hesitation, Caleb nodded. "Do as Miss Collins says." They ate in companionable silence, the awkwardness Harriet had anticipated failing to materialize. Caleb ate with appreciation, rather than the distracted haste she'd observed on previous evenings, even complimenting the stew's seasoning. After the meal, instead of retreating to his study as usual, Caleb surprised her by lingering at the table. While she helped the children prepare for bed, she could feel his eyes on her as she efficiently managed Rose's bath, helped James with his buttons, and checked Emma's work on a simple mathematics problem she'd assigned. When she returned from settling the children, Caleb was still at the table, a small wooden box before him. "This was my mother's," he said, opening it to reveal a simple gold band. "It seems right you should have something to mark our arrangement, even before the official ceremony." Harriet accepted the ring, unexpectedly touched by the gesture. "It's beautiful. It's practical," he corrected, though something in his tone suggested he was pleased by her response. "The hands respect a wedding band, makes things simpler." As she slipped the ring onto her finger, Harriet realized this was perhaps the most honest beginning to a marriage she could have hoped for. No false promises or romantic delusions, just two people facing reality together. "I should warn you," she said, meeting his gaze directly. "I'm still the same woman who was too old and outspoken for Pine Creek. That won't change, even here." For the first time, Harriet saw what might have been the ghost of a smile touch the corner of his mouth. "Miss Collins, Harriet, if I wanted a young, inexperienced woman, I'd have sent for one. The Circle T doesn't need youth and beauty. It needs wisdom and strength." The fire crackled between them, casting warm light on two faces marked in different ways by life's passages. Outside, the vast Colorado night wrapped around the ranch house, stars emerging one by one above the snow-covered valley. Despite the cold beyond the windows, Harriet felt something unexpected begin to thaw within her. Not hope exactly, not yet, but perhaps the possibility of it. The hands of the grandfather clock in the hall marked the passage of minutes as they sat in silence, neither feeling the need to fill the quiet with unnecessary words. In that moment of wordless understanding, Harriet Collins, soon to be Thornton, knew she had finally found a place where her years would be an asset rather than a liability. What neither could possibly know was how soon that wisdom would be tested, or how the coming winter would bring challenges that would require every measure of experience they both possessed. The weeks following Mrs. Fletcher's departure settled into a rhythm that suited Harriet's methodical nature. Mornings began before dawn, with the preparation of breakfast for Caleb and the ranch hands. By the time the men trudged in from the bunkhouse, stamping snow from their boots and bringing with them the scent of cold air and horses, she had hot coffee, biscuits, and salt pork waiting. December deepened, bringing shorter days and longer nights. The snow drifts grew taller around the barn walls, and the paths between buildings required daily clearing. Harriet adapted to ranch life with the same determination that had carried her through previous challenges, tackling each new task as a puzzle to be solved rather than an obstacle to overcome. More significant than her adaptation to ranch duties was her growing relationship with the children. Emma remained cautious, but her open defiance had been replaced by a watchful acceptance. One evening, Harriet discovered the girl attempting to mend a torn book page with clumsy stitches. "Would you like me to show you a better way?" Harriet offered, careful not to criticize the child's efforts. Emma hesitated, then nodded. "Mama used to fix my books. Mrs. Fletcher didn't have time." "Your mother sounds like a wonderful woman who loved you very much," Harriet said gently as she demonstrated the proper way to repair the page. "Papa doesn't like to talk about her," Emma confided, watching Harriet's hands carefully. "It makes him sad." "Losing someone you love creates a special kind of sadness," Harriet explained, "but remembering them keeps a part of them alive in our hearts. Did you lose someone too?" Emma's perceptive eyes studied Harriet's face. "My parents and a brother in the war. Different kinds of loss, but yes. Is that why you understand sadness?" "Perhaps," Harriet replied thoughtfully. "Experience teaches us many things if we're willing to learn." James required a different approach. His boundless energy, which had initially manifested as disruptive behavior, needed purposeful direction. Harriet began giving him small responsibilities, gathering eggs, helping to knead bread dough, sorting kindling, that made him feel important, while simultaneously teaching him patience and attention to detail. Rose flourished most visibly under Harriet's care. The fretful toddler who had greeted her that first morning was rapidly transforming into a cheerful, increasingly verbal child who followed Harriet like a shadow during the day and fell asleep each night to the sound of Harriet's voice singing lullabies she remembered from her teaching days. "Walter says you've established a schoolroom in the old sewing room," Caleb remarked one evening as they sat before the fire, these quiet hours after supper having become a wordless ritual, each occupied with their own tasks, but sharing the companionable silence. Harriet looked up from the ledger, where she'd been recording household expenses. "Emma needs consistent education, and James benefits from structured learning time as well. I hope that's acceptable." "Your house, your decision," Caleb replied, returning to the breeding records he was reviewing. The simple phrase carried weight beyond its brevity. Your house, not Mrs. Fletcher's anymore, not even just his. In 3 words, Caleb had acknowledged her place and authority within the household. As Christmas approached, Harriet noticed the children growing increasingly withdrawn. Emma became more solemn, James more reckless in his play, and Rose clingier than usual. When she mentioned these changes to Caleb, his expression darkened. "Catherine died 2 days before Christmas," he said quietly. "Last year was difficult." Harriet's heart ached for these children whose holiday memories were forever entwined with loss. "Perhaps we could establish new traditions," she suggested, cautiously. "Not to replace the old ones, but to stand alongside them." Caleb's expression remained guarded, but he nodded. "What did you have in mind?" Drawing on childhood memories and her years of teaching, Harriet began planning. She set aside flour and sugar from their precious stores, dried fruit that had been carefully hoarded, and even negotiated with the cook at the bunkhouse for a small portion of the molasses reserved for the hands. Caleb raised an eyebrow at her ambitious preparations, but offered no objection. If anything, she detected a flicker of something like curiosity in his usually shuttered expression. 2 days before Christmas, while checking the cold storage cellar for potatoes, Harriet discovered a small pine tree that had been carefully placed behind the barrels. Its presence was puzzling until Frank appeared at her elbow, looking uncharacteristically sheepish. "Thought the house could use something festive," he mumbled. "Mrs. Thornton always put up a tree." Harriet's throat tightened unexpectedly. "That's very thoughtful, Frank. Would you help me bring it inside?" Together, they set up the tree in the parlor's front window. Harriet found a box of simple ornaments in the attic, wooden stars, pine cones dipped in wax, and red ribbon carefully preserved from previous years. She involved the children in the decorating, telling them stories of Christmas traditions from around the world as they worked. Later, she felt Caleb's presence in the doorway, watching silently. "Catherine loved Christmas," he said, his voice holding none of its usual gruffness. "Spent weeks making small surprises for everyone." It was the first time he had voluntarily spoken of his late wife, and Harriet recognized the significance. What was her favorite part of the celebration? Caleb moved into the room, reaching out to touch one of the wooden stars with work-roughened fingers. "The singing. She played the piano. We had one then. All of us would gather around on Christmas Eve, even the hands who couldn't carry a tune in a bucket." "The piano was lost?" Harriet asked gently. "Sold," he corrected. "After she died. Too many memories." Understanding flooded Harriet. The barren walls, the absence of feminine touches. Caleb had systematically removed reminders of Catherine, not from lack of sentiment, but from an excess of it. Christmas Eve dawned clear and bitterly cold. Harriet rose early to begin preparations for the holiday feast, filling the house with the aromas of roasting chicken and baking bread. She had enlisted Emma's help with simple decorations. Pine boughs gathered from around the property now adorned the mantel and staircase. By midday, the table was set with Mrs. Fletcher's best linens, and Harriet had wrapped small gifts for each child. A book of poetry for Emma that she'd brought from Boston, a carved wooden horse for James that Frank had helped her commission from one of the hands who had a talent for whittling, and a soft cloth doll for Rose that Harriet had sewn during late evenings. For Caleb, she had carefully mended his mother's Bible, which she'd found in the study with its spine cracked and several pages coming loose. The simple repair represented hours of patient work after the children were asleep. When Caleb and the three remaining hands, Frank, Martinez, and young Davis, gathered for the evening meal, Harriet saw approval in their faces. The normally austere dining room had been transformed with candlelight and greenery. The food, while simple by Eastern standards, represented the best the ranch could offer in the depths of winter. "Mrs. Thornton has outdone herself," Frank announced, using the title that still felt foreign to Harriet's ears, though Caleb had introduced her as such to the hands after Mrs. Fletcher's departure. Their official marriage ceremony would wait until spring, when travel to town became possible again. "Indeed she has," Caleb agreed, his eyes meeting Harriet's across the table with unexpected warmth. After the meal, they gathered in the parlor, where the little tree glowed with candles carefully clipped to its branches. Harriet had wrapped small gifts for each man, knitted scarves for Martinez and Davis, tobacco for Frank, and for Caleb the repaired Bible. "It isn't much," she explained as he ran his fingers over the carefully mended binding. "I noticed it. Was well loved but needed some care. This was my grandmother's," Caleb said, his voice unusually soft. "Thank you." In return, Frank presented her with a beautifully crafted wooden cutting board. Martinez and Davis offered a jar of honey they had traded from a passing trapper, and Caleb disappeared briefly, returning with a small package wrapped in brown paper. "It isn't much," he echoed her words, handing it to Harriet. Inside was a silver thimble and sewing scissors, their handles inlaid with mother-of-pearl. "They were Catherine's," Caleb explained, his voice steady, though the admission clearly cost him something. "She would have wanted them used by someone who appreciates fine craftsmanship." The unexpectedness of the gift rendered Harriet momentarily speechless. These precious items represented more than mere objects. They were an acknowledgement that she wasn't a replacement for Catherine, but a new presence who could honor what came before while creating something different. "Thank you," she said simply, knowing he would understand the depth of gratitude behind the understated response. Later, after the hands had retired to the bunkhouse and the house had grown quiet, Harriet found herself alone with Caleb by the fire. The children had been put to bed, each clutching their gifts and, for the first time since she'd arrived, falling asleep with smiles on their faces. This was the first Christmas since Catherine died that felt like a celebration, Caleb said finally, his gaze fixed on the flames. She would have approved. The compliment, indirect though it was, warmed Harriet more than the fire before them. She had dreaded Christmas as a potentially painful reminder of all the children had lost. Instead, it had become a tentative bridge between past and present. January brought blizzards that confined everyone to their respective quarters for days at a time. Harriet used the enforced isolation to tackle long-neglected mending, inventory, their supplies, and establish a more formal educational routine for the children. To her surprise, Caleb began joining them occasionally, listening as she conducted lessons on history and literature, sometimes adding his own knowledge of practical mathematics or geography learned through his years of ranching. It was during one such informal lesson, as Harriet was explaining the constellations to an enraptured James, that she first noticed Caleb watching her with an expression that wasn't simply appreciation for her teaching skills, but something more personal. The awareness startled her, and she found herself stumbling over the names of stars she'd known since childhood. That evening, as she sat by the fire marking Emma's arithmetic exercises, Caleb broke their customary comfortable silence. "You've done more for my children in 1 month than I managed in a year," he said unexpectedly, his voice low. Harriet looked up, startled by the admission. They're remarkable children. They simply needed stability and attention. And someone who wasn't afraid to mother them, Caleb added. I've been so focused on providing for their physical needs that I neglected the rest. Grief takes different forms, Harriet replied gently. You kept them fed, housed, and safe until you could find someone to help with the rest. There's wisdom in recognizing one's limitations. Caleb studied her face in the firelight. You speak, and from experience. During the war, I learned that strength sometimes means acknowledging when you can't do everything alone. She set aside Emma's papers. There's no shame in needing help, Mr. Thornton. Caleb, he corrected. After sharing Christmas and surviving January blizzards together, I think we've earned the right to use given names, Harriet. The simple exchange marked another shift in their relationship, small but significant. February brought thaws and freezes, in unpredictable cycles, making ranch work treacherous. The men returned each evening exhausted, sometimes injured from falls on ice or kicks from nervous horses. Harriet expanded her duties to include tending these injuries, applying poultices and bandages with the efficiency she had developed during her nursing days. It was during one of these bitter cold spells that disaster struck. Caleb and Frank had ridden out at dawn to check on a group of pregnant cows isolated in a sheltered valley 2 miles from the main ranch. By midday, when they had not returned, young Davis volunteered to look for them. He returned an hour later, his face white with cold and fear. Avalanche in the North Valley, he gasped as Harriet met him at the door. Path is blocked. No sign of the boss or Frank. Harriet's mind raced with calculations. How long the men had been exposed to the elements, how quickly hypothermia could set in, what resources they had for a rescue. Get Martinez and prepare the horses, she instructed Davis. Bring ropes, shovels, and the medical supplies from the pantry cabinet. I'll prepare hot bricks and blankets. Mrs. Thornton, Davis hesitated. The route through Bear Canyon is still open, but it's dangerous in these conditions. Martinez thinks we should wait for better weather. Caleb and Frank could freeze to death while we wait, Harriet cut him off. We leave in 20 minutes. The young ranch hand blinked at her tone, but nodded quickly. Yes, ma'am. Harriet changed into the warmest clothing she owned. Woolen trousers she had fashioned from an old blanket, layers of shirts and sweaters, thick socks, and the heavy boots Caleb had ordered for her from the general store. Around her waist she buckled a belt that held a hunting knife and small hatchet. Emma appeared in the doorway, her young face solemn with understanding beyond her years. You're going after Papa? Yes, Harriet confirmed, seeing no reason to shield the child from the truth. "Davis and Martinez will help me find him and bring him home." "What about us?" Emma asked, gesturing to where James and Rose watched wide-eyed from the hallway. Harriet knelt before her. "I need you to be in charge here. Keep the fire burning. Watch your brother and sister and be ready to help when we return. Can you do that?" Emma straightened, accepting the responsibility with a nod. "Like you showed me. I'll be brave." "You already are," Harriet said, embracing her quickly before turning to the boys. "James, you help your sister. Rose, be a good girl until I return." As Harriet emerged from the house, the ranch hands were gathered by the barn, preparing horses and supplies. Their expressions registered surprise at her attire, but no one voiced an objection as she issued clear, concise orders. "Davis, you're the best tracker. You'll lead. Martinez and I will follow with the medical supplies. We'll approach through Bear Canyon single file, maintaining voice contact at all times." The men exchanged glances, unused to taking orders from a woman, but the urgency of the situation overrode any hesitation. Bear Canyon earned its name honestly, a narrow passage between sheer rock faces, treacherous in the best conditions, potentially lethal now with ice glazing its surfaces and snow threatening to slide from overhanging ledges. Harriet focused on guiding her horse carefully, ignoring the gnawing fear that threatened to overwhelm her practical nature. The journey that normally took 40 minutes stretched to nearly 2 hours of careful navigation. When they finally emerged from the canyon, the North Valley spread before them, or rather what remained of it. A massive wall of snow and debris had swept down the mountainside, obliterating the trail and part of the sheltered meadow where the cattle had been kept. "Spread out," Harriet called. "Look for any sign, tracks, disturbed snow, anything that doesn't belong." The men fanned across the area, calling for Caleb and Frank. Harriet scanned the terrain systematically, forcing herself to think like Caleb would in this situation. The cattle had been kept in a natural enclosure formed by a stand of pines and a rock outcropping. If the men had reached them before the avalanche— "There!" she shouted, pointing toward a dark shape protruding from the snow near the tree line. "Davis, bring the ropes." As they approached, the shape resolved into the hindquarters of a horse, partially buried. The animal was dead, its body already growing stiff. Harriet recognized Caleb's saddle blanket pattern with a sinking heart. "They must be nearby," she said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "They wouldn't have abandoned their mounts unless they were seeking shelter." The rock outcropping that formed one wall of the cattle enclosure rose about 12 feet high, with a slight overhang that might offer minimal protection. Harriet circled it, scanning for any sign of human presence. A flash of color caught her eye, a scrap of fabric caught on a jagged edge of rock. Moving closer, she discovered a narrow crevice, barely visible unless one stood at exactly the right angle. "Here!" she called sharply. "There's an opening!" Davis arrived at her side, peering into the darkness. "Could be a bear den. Or it could be the only shelter available to men caught in an avalanche," Harriet countered, already removing her gloves to better feel the edges of the opening. "Mr. Thornton, Frank, can you hear me?" At first only silence answered. Then faintly a sound emerged. Not a voice, but a deliberate tapping. 3 sharp raps, followed by 3 more. "They're alive!" Harriet's voice cracked with relief. "Quick, the ropes! We need to widen this opening!" What followed was a grueling test of endurance as the rescue party carefully cleared snow and smaller rocks from the crevice entrance. The opening gradually widened enough for Harriet, being the smallest among them, to squeeze through with a lantern. The space beyond was larger than the entrance suggested, a shallow cave extending about 10 feet into the rock face. Huddled at the back were Caleb and Frank, the latter unconscious and wrapped in both their coats. Caleb hunched protectively. Beside him, his face grey with cold and exhaustion. "Harriet?" Caleb's voice was hoarse with disbelief. "How did you find us?" "Later," she replied, already assessing Frank's condition. "We need to get you both out before another slide comes down." Frank had suffered a broken leg and showed signs of hypothermia. Caleb had fared somewhat better physically, though his hands were blue with cold and his breathing labored. Moving them through the narrow opening required careful coordination and Harriet's firm direction to the ranch hands. By the time they secured both men on horses for the journey home, darkness was falling, making the return through Bear Canyon even more perilous. Harriet rode beside Caleb, supporting him when he swayed with exhaustion. "The cattle," he murmured at one point. "We were checking on them when we heard the slide start." "Davis found them," Harriet assured him. They moved to higher ground instinctively, all safe, including the pregnant ones. Caleb nodded, his eyes closing briefly. "You shouldn't have risked the canyon in these conditions." Harriet met his gaze steadily. "Would you have done differently if our positions were reversed?" The question hung between them, finally answered with the barest hint of a smile on Caleb's wind-chapped lips. "No, but I would have expected no less from you." At that moment, as snowflakes began to fall around them and the difficult journey home still stretched ahead, Harriet understood that something fundamental had changed. Caleb Thornton had seen her not just as capable or wise, but as his equal. Someone who would risk everything for what mattered, just as he would. And in his eyes, Harriet Collins, the mail-order bride rejected for being too old, had finally found what she had sought all along. Not just respect, but recognition of her true worth. The children were waiting at the window when the rescue party finally reached the ranch, Emma having maintained her vigil despite the late hour. Her small face crumpled with relief at the sight of her father, and she raced to open the door, James and Rose trailing behind her. "Inside, quickly," Harriet directed as the men helped Caleb and Frank from their horses. "Emma, the fire needs building up. James, fetch the extra blankets from the chest upstairs." The children responded instantly to her commands, moving with purpose rather than panic. Harriet felt a surge of pride at their composure, even as she focused on the immediate needs of the injured men. Frank's condition was the most serious. His broken leg needed setting, and his body temperature was dangerously low. With Martinez's help, Harriet moved him to the small room off the kitchen that had once been Mrs. Fletcher's quarters. "We need to warm him gradually," she explained, directing Martinez to prepare hot water bottles wrapped in towels to place around Frank's torso, while she carefully splinted his leg. Too much heat too quickly could damage his heart. "You have a remarkable mind," he remarked one evening as they discussed improvements to the cold storage cellar. "You see possibilities others miss." Coming from Caleb, the simple observation carried more weight than flowery compliments from her previous suitors. Harriet felt a warm glow of satisfaction that had nothing to do with romantic notions and everything to do with genuine appreciation of her abilities. The children, too, were flourishing under the new dynamic in the household. With Caleb present more often, they began to relax around their father, approaching him with small questions and observations they had previously kept to themselves. Harriet noticed how he made conscious efforts to engage with them, listening. To Emma read aloud from her lessons, helping James construct a crude slingshot, rocking Rose on his lap in the evenings. One afternoon, as Harriet was hanging laundry in the weak March sunshine, she overheard Emma and Caleb on the porch, their voices carrying clearly in the still air. "Papa, is Harriet truly our mother now?" Emma asked with a child's directness. There was a pause before Caleb answered. "She's married to me, which makes her your stepmother, but being a mother is about more than just a name." "She does mother things," Emma observed. "She teaches us and makes soup when we're sick, and knows when James is lying. About washing his hands." Harriet heard the smile in Caleb's voice as he replied, "Yes, she does. But she's different from Mama." "Yes," Caleb agreed, his tone gentle. "Every person is different, Emma. Your mother loved you very much, and nothing can change that. Harriet cares for you too in her own way. I think Mama would like her," Emma said after a moment's consideration. "She's old, but she knows important things." Harriet had to press her hand against her mouth to suppress a laugh at this backhanded compliment. To her surprise, she heard Caleb chuckle, a warm, rusty sound she'd never heard before. "Don't let Harriet hear you call her old," he advised his daughter. "But yes, she does know important things. We're fortunate she came to us." The simple acknowledgement, not meant for her ears, affected Harriet more deeply than any direct praise could have. Caleb Thornton, a man of few words, had defended her worth to his daughter and expressed gratitude for her presence in their lives. By mid-March, the snow began its reluctant retreat from the valley. Patches of muddy ground emerged, growing larger each day. The creek that cut through Circle T property swelled with snowmelt, its gentle summer burble transformed into a rushing torrent. With improving weather came the first calves of the season. Harriet found herself drafted into birthing duty when 2 cows went into labor simultaneously one cold morning. Under Caleb's calm direction, she helped deliver a spindly-legged calf, her sleeves rolled up and arms deep in the messy miracle of birth. "Good hands," Caleb commented afterward as they watched the wobbly newborn nurse for the first time. "Steady. The cow trusted you." Harriet wiped sweat from her brow, aware she must look a fright covered in straw and less mentionable substances, yet feeling an unexpected satisfaction. It was remarkable, creating your future herd right before your eyes. "Building something that lasts," Caleb agreed, his expression softening as he watched the cow nuzzle her calf. "That's what this place is about." As March yielded to April, the pace of ranch life accelerated. Fields needed preparation for spring planting. Cattle returned from winter grazing lands for counting and branding. The last calves arrived, completing the season's new crop. Through it all, Harriet and Caleb worked in increasingly seamless partnership. She took over the ranch accounts entirely, freeing him to focus on breeding decisions and pasture management. When spring cleaning required moving heavy furniture, he appeared without being asked to help shift the massive oak wardrobe that had belonged to Catherine. Caleb, though exhausted and chilled, insisted on helping until Harriet fixed him with a stern look that brooked no argument. "You're no use to anyone if you collapse," she said firmly. "Sit by the fire and let Emma tend to you while I see to Frank." To everyone's surprise, including perhaps his own, Caleb obeyed. Emma, her young face solemn with responsibility, wrapped her father in blankets and brought him the hot tea Harriet had prepared. Hours passed as Harriet worked to stabilize Frank, applying her nursing experience with calm efficiency. When she finally emerged from the sick room, the first grey light of dawn was seeping through the windows. The children had fallen asleep, James and Rose curled together on the sofa, Emma in the chair beside her father, her small hand still, clutching his. Caleb was awake, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. "Frank?" he asked quietly. "Sleeping now. The leg is set and his temperature is improving. He'll need weeks to recover, but he should heal completely with proper care." Caleb nodded, relief evident in the slight relaxation of his shoulders. "And you? You've been tending everyone else for hours." The simple question, acknowledgement of her needs rather than just her capabilities, touched Harriet unexpectedly. "I'm tired," she admitted, "but satisfied. You saved our lives today." His voice was low, mindful of the sleeping children. "I won't forget that. We saved you together," Harriet corrected gently. "Davis, Martinez, all of us. But it was you who insisted on immediate action, you who knew what to do for Frank." His gaze held hers steadily. "You who kept my children calm and gave them purpose instead of fear." Harriet felt a warm flush rise in her cheeks at his direct praise. "Experience has its uses," she said simply. "Yes," Caleb agreed, his eyes never leaving her face. "It does." The weeks following the avalanche rescue brought new dimensions to life at the Circle T. Frank's recovery confined him to bed in the main house, where Harriet tended his broken leg and gradually nursed him back to health. Caleb, though physically less injured, fought a persistent cough that had developed after hours in the frigid cave. "Lung inflammation," Harriet diagnosed, recognizing the symptoms from her nursing days. "You need rest and steam treatments." Caleb predictably resisted. "Spring calving begins in 3 weeks. There's no time for coddling. And there's no time for burying the ranch owner either," Harriet countered, meeting his stubborn glare with equal determination. "The men can manage the preparations. Davis knows the breeding schedule almost as well as you do." Their battle of wills ended in compromise. Caleb would rest mornings and submit to treatments, then supervise afternoon work from the house porch, delegating tasks rather than performing them himself. This new arrangement inadvertently created opportunities for them to interact in ways they hadn't before. Harriet included Caleb in household decisions previously handled solely by her. Caleb, for his part, began explaining ranch operations and breeding philosophies as they reviewed ledgers. Together at the kitchen table, "These bloodlines," Harriet noted, tracing a finger along a complex chart of cattle lineages, "you've developed them specifically for hardiness rather than size." Caleb nodded, pleased by her observation. "Mountain winters demand cattle with endurance and good foraging instincts. These Herefords crossed with the original Longhorns produce calves that survive where purebreds fail." "You served in the war," Harriet said, noting a gap in the breeding records that coincided with the conflict. It was the first direct reference either had made to his military past, though she had noticed a Confederate cavalry saber mounted in his study. 8th Texas Cavalry, he confirmed, his expression growing distant. "Joined at 18, 2 years before the end." "You were very young, not by war's measure." His voice held no bitterness, merely acceptance. "Came west after Appomattox. Seemed a more honorable profession than most available to former rebels." These quiet conversations revealed layers to Caleb Thornton that his taciturn exterior concealed. A self-educated man with firm principles, unexpected knowledge of literature from long winter evenings with little entertainment, and a dry humor. that emerged when he felt comfortable. In turn, Caleb discovered that behind Harriet's practical efficiency lay a sharp intellect and surprising knowledge of subjects ranging from medicine to agriculture, gleaned from years of teaching and nursing. They developed an unspoken language of nods and glances that communicated more efficiently than words. The planned trip to Pine Creek for their official marriage ceremony kept being postponed. First by Frank's recovery needs, then by calving season, then by the creek flooding the main road. "The hands already call you Mrs. Thornton," Caleb pointed out when Harriet mentioned the matter. "The paperwork is a formality." Yet beneath the practical exterior of their arrangement, subtle changes emerged. Caleb began bringing Harriet wildflowers. He found while checking fence lines, Harriet took particular care with the coffee cake she knew he favored. Their evening conversations by the fire stretched longer, occasionally veering into personal territory neither had previously broached. "Did you leave someone behind in Boston?" Caleb asked one such evening. "A suitor your family might have approved of before circumstances changed?" Harriet considered the question, surprised by his interest in her past. "There was a doctor at the hospital where I nursed during the war. He expressed interest after my father died. My brother thought it a sensible match." "But you didn't." "It wasn't a question. He wanted a nurse to assist in his practice and manage his household. Nothing more. When he described our potential life together, I was to be useful but invisible, present when needed, absent when inconvenient." She smiled slightly at the memory. "He thought my age made me suitable, less likely to expect romance or companionship, more willing to accept a practical arrangement." "He clearly hadn't taken your measure," Caleb observed, a hint of that rare smile touching his lips. "Few men do," she replied simply, "until they find themselves unsettled by it." The unspoken question lingered between them. Had he taken her measure correctly? Did her forthright nature and accumulated wisdom unsettle him as it had the others? But Caleb merely nodded, as if confirming something to himself, and turned the conversation to the next day's tasks. In late April, a letter arrived from Mrs. Fletcher, carried by a passing freight wagon. Along with news of her sister's improved health came a startling announcement. Mrs. Fletcher had reconnected with a childhood friend, now a widowed shopkeeper, and planned to marry in June. "She won't be returning to the Circle T," Caleb said, after reading the letter, his tone neutral, though Harriet detected a hint of concern in his expression. "This changes matters," Harriet observed, setting aside the bread dough she'd been kneading. "How so?" "Our arrangement presumed Mrs. Fletcher's eventual return. With her settling permanently in Denver, the management of this household becomes a longer commitment than we agreed to." Caleb studied her face. "Are you suggesting our arrangement should end?" "I'm suggesting you deserve the opportunity to reconsider." Harriet met his gaze directly. "When you offered for me, you needed immediate help with the children, not a permanent wife. And now you think I might prefer someone younger once the immediate crisis has passed." There was no accusation in his tone, merely a statement of what he perceived as her concern. Harriet's hands stilled on the countertop. "It would be natural. The children are more settled now. You could seek a wife who might give them siblings, who would be a true mother rather than a—" "Stop," Caleb interrupted, more firmly than he'd ever spoken to her. "Don't finish that sentence." He crossed the kitchen to stand before her, close, enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his blue eyes. Harriet, I offered you a marriage of convenience because that was all I believed I had the right to ask for. I thought myself fortunate that a woman of your capabilities would consider such an arrangement even temporarily." His voice softened. "What I didn't anticipate was how essential you would become, not just to the children, but to me." The simple admission hung in the air between them, more intimate than any physical touch. "You've brought life back to this house," he continued, "not by erasing what came before, but by helping us move forward." Emma laughs again. James focuses for more than 3 minutes at a time. Rose is thriving, and He paused, searching for words. "I find myself looking forward to our evenings by the fire, to hearing your perspectives on everything from cattle breeding to Shakespeare, to simply knowing you're here." Harriet felt her heart beating faster than the simple exchange warranted. "What are you saying, Caleb?" "I'm saying I don't want to reconsider our arrangement. If anything, I'd like to deepen it, not out of convenience or necessity, but from choice." Before Harriet could respond, the patter of small feet in the hallway announced Rose's awakening from her nap. The moment of revelation was set aside as daily life resumed its demands, but something had shifted between them. A door opened that neither could now pretend remained closed. The planned trip to Pine Creek 2 weeks later marked Harriet's first return to the town since her departure 6 months earlier. She found herself viewing the dusty main street with new eyes, no longer as an unwanted mail-order bride seeking acceptance, but as the capable partner of a respected rancher. "Mrs. Thornton!" Mrs. Landry called, hurrying from the boarding-house porch. "What a wonderful surprise!" The genuine warmth in the older woman's greeting touched Harriet. They had corresponded briefly through infrequent mail deliveries, but seeing a familiar, friendly face was unexpectedly moving. "You're looking well," Mrs. Landry continued, giving Harriet an appraising glance. "Ranch life clearly agrees with you." "It's been educational," Harriet replied with a smile. "And the children. Frank wrote about the avalanche this winter. Terrifying business." "We managed," Harriet said simply, not elaborating on her role in the rescue. "Caleb and Frank have both recovered fully." Pastor Williams performed the ceremony in his small church that afternoon, with Mrs. Landry and Frank serving as witnesses. The simple exchange of vows felt almost anticlimactic after the months of building partnership that had preceded it. Yet Harriet found herself unexpectedly moved when Caleb slipped his mother's ring, which she had continued to wear since he first gave it to her, onto her finger as an official wedding band. "Not much different than before," Frank commented at the small celebration Mrs. Landry insisted on hosting afterward. "You two have been acting married since December." Harriet caught Caleb's eye across the room, noting the subtle quirk of his mouth that signaled amusement. Perhaps Frank was right. The certificate now tucked in Caleb's coat pocket merely formalized what daily life had already established between them. Their return to the Circle T coincided with the arrival of a spring storm, not the dangerous blizzards of winter, but a warm, persistent rain that transformed the ranch into a sea of mud and new grass. The hands had secured the livestock and equipment before their departure, so there was little to do but unload their few purchases and settle in to wait out the downpour. That evening, as thunder rolled across the valley, Harriet sat at the kitchen table updating the household ledger with their recent expenditures. Caleb entered quietly, setting a small package beside her workbook. "What's this?" she asked, looking up in surprise. "Something I picked up in town while you were visiting with Mrs. Landry." Harriet unwrapped the brown paper to reveal a small wooden box, intricately carved with a pattern of intertwined roses. Inside nestled a silver fountain pen with a pearl. "Inlay handle. Your current pen leaks," Caleb explained, suddenly appearing uncomfortable with the gesture. "I noticed the ink stains on your cuffs." Harriet ran a finger over the delicate craftsmanship of both box and pen. This was not a practical gift like the thimble and scissors at Christmas, which had family significance. This was something Caleb had selected specifically for her, noticing a detail most would overlook. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "Thank you." Caleb nodded, his hand flexing at his side, a gesture she had come to recognize as his response to emotional discomfort. "I should check the barn before turning in. The new calves get nervous in storms." Harriet watched him don his rain slicker and disappear into the deluge, understanding his need for space. Their relationship had developed according to clearly defined parameters, practical, respectful, and purposefully devoid of romantic entanglements. The gift represented a small step beyond those boundaries, and Caleb Thornton was not a man who stepped carelessly. Later that night, as lightning illuminated her bedroom in brief, brilliant flashes, Harriet found herself unable to sleep. The day's events had stirred emotions she had carefully contained since arriving at the Circle T. She had succeeded in creating a place for herself here, earning respect on her own terms rather than through conforming to others' expectations. The wisdom and experience that had rendered her unsuitable to 3 previous potential husbands had proven her greatest assets in this demanding environment. Yet something remained unsettled within her. The practical arrangement with Caleb had evolved into genuine partnership, perhaps even friendship. But as she turned the silver pen between her fingers in the darkness, Harriet acknowledged that her feelings had developed beyond the comfortable boundaries they had established. At 39, she had thought herself past the age of romantic longings, content with the compromise of security and respect. Now she found herself yearning for something she had never truly expected to find, a connection that honored her mind and experience while also recognizing her as a woman, not merely a caretaker or household manager. A tremendous crack of thunder shook the house, followed by the sound of a child's frightened cry. Harriet rose immediately, wrapping her robe around her as she hurried to the children's rooms. She found Rose standing in her crib, tears streaming down her face, arms outstretched in the universal plea of a frightened toddler. "Shh, darling," Harriet murmured, lifting the child against her shoulder. "It's only the storm. You're safe." She carried Rose back to her own room, settling in the rocking chair with the toddler cradled against her chest. As she sang softly, the same lullabies she had used to soothe wounded soldiers during the war, Rose's sobs gradually subsided into hiccups, then the deep, even breathing of sleep. Harriet continued rocking, reluctant to disturb the child's hard-won peace. In these quiet moments, with Rose's small weight warm against her and the storm raging outside, she felt a profound sense of rightness. She had never borne children of her own, had thought that possibility long past, yet here in this remote ranch house she had found a kind of motherhood she hadn't known to seek. The door creaked softly, and Harriet looked up to find Caleb standing in the doorway, his clothes still damp from the rain. His expression as he gazed at her, holding his sleeping daughter, held something she couldn't quite define. Tenderness, certainly, but also a kind of wonderment. "The thunder frightened her," Harriet whispered. Caleb nodded, moving into the room with uncharacteristic hesitation. "You have a gift with her, with all of them. They make it easy to love them," Harriet replied simply, the words slipping out before she could consider their implications. Caleb knelt beside the rocking chair, his eyes never leaving her face. "And their father? Is he also easy to love?" The directness of the question took Harriet's breath away. In the months they had lived and worked together, through crisis and celebration, neither had spoken of love. Their arrangement had been built on practical considerations: respect, shared purpose, the children's needs. Yet here, in the dim light of a stormy night, with Rose sleeping between them, Caleb had finally given voice to the unspoken current that had been gradually strengthening between them. "No," Harriet answered truthfully. "He is not easy to love. He is stubborn and proud and guards his heart like a fortress." Caleb's face fell slightly, but before he could withdraw, Harriet continued. "But the things most worth loving rarely come easily." Her voice remained soft, mindful of the sleeping child. "Your strength, your integrity, your devotion to your children, these are qualities that inspire not a fleeting affection, but a deeper regard that grows stronger with each passing day." She met his gaze steadily. "I didn't come to the Circle T seeking love, Caleb. At my age, I had set aside such hopes in favor of security and purpose. But sometimes we find treasures we weren't looking for, in places we least expect them. That I had no right to ask for more." His voice grew husky with emotion. "Then you arrived, not the young, pliable bride I expected, but a woman of strength and wisdom. You challenged me, respected me, saved me from more than just an avalanche." Rose stirred slightly in Harriet's arms, and they both paused, holding their breath until she settled again. Caleb's hand, rough from years of ranch work, reached up to touch her cheek with infinite gentleness. "When Catherine died, I thought that part of me died with her. I convinced myself that providing for the children was enough, that I had no right to ask for more." His voice grew husky with emotion. "Then you arrived, not the young, pliable bride I expected, but a woman of strength and wisdom. You challenged me, respected me, saved me from more than just an avalanche." Rose stirred slightly in Harriet's arms, and they both paused, holding their breath until she settled again. "I never thought I would find someone willing to take on a widower with 3 wild children, someone who could understand that loving again doesn't diminish what came before." Caleb's voice dropped to a whisper. "Someone who values experience over youth, wisdom over beauty, substance over illusion. Those who rejected me for being too old did us both a favor," Harriet observed with a small smile. "They cleared the path that led me here." Caleb rose to his feet, gently taking Rose from Harriet's arms. "Let me put her to bed. Then perhaps we could continue this conversation somewhere more private." The intimacy implied in his suggestion brought a flush to Harriet's cheeks that had nothing to do with the warmth of the room. At 39, she had assumed certain chapters of life were closed to her. Now, as she watched Caleb tenderly carrying his daughter back to her room, she realized that some stories don't follow conventional timelines. They unfold according to their own rhythm, revealing unexpected possibilities at every turn. When Caleb returned, he offered her his hand, helping her rise from the rocking chair. They stood for a moment, the air between them charged with unspoken feelings and new awareness. Then, with a deliberateness that made his intentions unmistakable, he bent to kiss her. Not a tentative gesture of newfound affection, but the certain claim of a man who had found what he had believed forever lost. Later, much later, as the storm gradually subsided and the first hints of dawn lightened the eastern sky, they lay together in the quiet of Harriet's room. The barriers that had separated them finally dissolved. Caleb's fingers traced the silver strands in her hair with reverence rather than regret. "Your experience shows in everything you do," he murmured against her temple. "Why would I wish for untried youth when I can have the sure wisdom of a woman who knows herself completely?" Harriet smiled against his shoulder. "3 men in Pine Creek might disagree with you." "3 men in Pine Creek were fools," Caleb replied simply. "Their loss, my gain." The morning brought clear skies and the daunting task of assessing storm damage. Harriet woke early, her body pleasantly tired, but her mind surprisingly clear. The revelation of feelings between her and Caleb had shifted something fundamental, yet the practical demands of ranch life remained unchanged. She dressed and made her way to the kitchen, finding Caleb already at the table with maps of the property spread before him. He looked up when she entered, his expression softening in a way that made her heart quicken despite her composure. "The creek receded to its banks," he reported. "Frank and Davis rode out at first light to check the south pasture fencing." Harriet nodded, moving to the stove to prepare coffee, grateful for the familiar routine that anchored this new reality. "And the animals?" "No losses among the breeding stock. 2 older steers from the working herd are missing. The hands are looking for them." Their conversation maintained its usual efficiency, but beneath the practical exchange lay a new awareness. When Harriet placed a coffee cup before him, Caleb's fingers brushed hers deliberately. When he explained his concerns about erosion along the creek bed, he pulled her chair closer to his so she could better see the map. These small gestures spoke volumes between 2 people unaccustomed to expressing sentiment openly. They had acknowledged something profound during the storm, but neither seemed eager to define it with words that might constrain what was still evolving between them. The following days brought endless work. Fields that had been prepared for. Planting now required draining and reworking. Fences needed repair where floodwaters had damaged posts or washed away sections entirely, and the road to Pine Creek was temporarily impassable where a culvert had collapsed. Through it all, Harriet and Caleb worked in tandem, their existing partnership enhanced rather than complicated by their new understanding. If the ranch hands noticed the lingering glances or the way their hands sought each other in unguarded moments, they had the good sense not to comment. Only Frank, observing them across the supper table, allowed himself a knowing smile, quickly hidden behind his coffee cup. May arrived with a burst of wildflowers across the valley, and the first visitors to the Circle T since winter. 3 men on horseback appeared one afternoon, their mounts bearing the distinctive brand of the Bar S, a large cattle operation 2 valleys over. Harriet was in the kitchen garden when they rode up, Caleb striding from the barn to meet them. From her vantage point, she could see the stiffness in his posture as he greeted the riders. "Afternoon, Thornton," the lead rider called, a tall man with a silver-streaked beard and an air of authority. "Been a while." "Stanton," Caleb acknowledged with a curt nod. "What brings you to the Circle T? Heard you got some fine Hereford bulls. Thought it might be time to discuss business." Caleb's stance remained guarded. "Circle T bloodlines aren't for sale, as I've told your foreman before." Stanton dismounted despite the cool reception, handing his reins to one of his companions. Every man has his price, Thornton, especially when spring floods damage his operation. His gaze travelled assessingly over the property, noting the repairs still in progress. Harriet set aside her trowel and rose, brushing soil from her skirts. As she approached the men, Caleb's eyes flickered to her, a silent warning in their depths. "Mr. Stanton, I presume." She extended her hand with the confidence she'd once used in the hospital when dealing with difficult doctors. "Harriet Thornton, my husband and I welcome you to the Circle T." Stanton's eyebrows rose in surprise as he automatically took her offered hand. "Thornton, you old dog, no one mentioned you'd remarried." "Recent development," Caleb replied tersely. "Well, congratulations are in order then." Stanton's shrewd gaze shifted between them, recalculating his approach. "Perhaps we could discuss business over coffee. The ride from Bar S works up a thirst." Harriet recognized the tactical retreat. "Of course. Please come inside while your men water the horses." In the kitchen, she served coffee and the last of a berry pie while listening to Stanton's carefully casual inquiries about the ranch's operations. Though he addressed most questions to Caleb, his eyes frequently returned to Harriet with speculative interest. "Your wife seems quite knowledgeable about your breeding program, Thornton," he observed after Harriet corrected a detail about calving. "Dates. Mrs. Thornton manages the business records," Caleb replied, the slightest emphasis on her name marking his territory in the subtle way of frontiersmen. Stanton leaned back in his chair, a new respect in his expression. "Unusual arrangement." "Efficient arrangement," Harriet countered smoothly. "Mr. Thornton's expertise is better applied to breeding than bookkeeping." "Smart woman," Stanton nodded appreciatively. "Rare quality in these parts." The conversation eventually circled back to Stanton's original purpose, acquiring breeding rights to one of the Circle T's prize Hereford bulls. Harriet watched the negotiation unfold with growing fascination. Stanton was clearly a skilled businessman, alternating flattery with veiled threats about the economic challenges facing small operations like the Circle T. Caleb remained unmoved. "The Circle T is doing just fine, Stanton. Our reputation for quality speaks for itself." "Quality doesn't matter if you can't get your stock to market," Stanton countered. "The new railroad spur is going in on Bar S land, and anyone wanting to ship cattle east will be paying me for the privilege." Harriet saw Caleb's jaw tighten. A tell she had learned indicated suppressed anger. Before he could respond, she interjected smoothly, "How fortunate for the Bar S. Though I understand the territorial governor has expressed concerns about monopolistic practices affecting smaller ranchers." She smiled pleasantly, reaching for the coffee pot. "More coffee, Mr. Stanton?" Stanton blinked, visibly recalibrating. "You seem well informed about territorial politics, Mrs. Thornton." "I find it's important to understand factors that might impact our business," Harriet replied. "Just last month in Pine Creek, Judge Morrison mentioned the legislature is considering regulations to ensure fair access to transportation infrastructure." It was a calculated bluff based on fragments of conversation she had overheard months ago at Arthur Patterson's dinner party, but Stanton's expression confirmed she had struck a nerve. "Politics has no place in business," he grumbled. "On that, we agree," Caleb said, the tension in his posture easing slightly as he followed Harriet's lead. "Which is why the Circle T prefers straightforward transactions. We sell our stock directly to buyers who appreciate quality, no middleman required." The meeting ended with Stanton departing empty-handed, but clearly reassessing the Circle T's vulnerability. As the riders disappeared down the valley, Caleb turned to Harriet with newfound appreciation in his gaze. That bit about the territorial governor was inspired, he said. Stanton's been trying to pressure smaller operations out of business for years. Harriet shrugged slightly. Men like that believe they can intimidate anyone who seems vulnerable. I simply suggested we aren't as isolated as he assumed. Caleb's hand touched her cheek in a rare public gesture of affection. You continue to surprise me, Harriet Thornton. The encounter with Stanton marked a turning point in how Harriet viewed her place at the Circle T. No longer was she merely managing a household or even partnering in daily operations. She had defended the ranch against external threats as fiercely as Caleb himself would have. This revelation accompanied another significant change. That night, after the house had grown quiet and the lamps were extinguished, Caleb appeared at her bedroom door. No words seemed necessary as Harriet welcomed him across the threshold that had separated them for months. Their marriage of convenience had evolved into something neither had anticipated, a true union of equals, bound by mutual respect, shared purpose, and now undeniable love. Later, as moonlight spilled through the window and Caleb's breathing deepened into sleep beside her, Harriet reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The mail-order bride rejected for being too old had found her place not by diminishing her years to accommodate others' expectations, but by finding a partner who valued that very quality. The summer unfolded in a pattern of productive days and intimate nights, their business partnership now enriched by deeper connection. Harriet expanded her involvement in ranch operations, learning to judge cattle with an increasingly discerning eye and developing marketing strategies that complemented Caleb's breeding expertise. Caleb, in turn, revealed more of himself. Memories of his childhood in Texas before the war, stories of Catherine and their early years together that no longer carried unbearable pain in the telling. The children blossomed under the warmth of this new family harmony. Emma, now 8, had transformed from a solemn, watchful child into a confident girl who proudly helped with the accounts, her facility with numbers exceeding even Harriet's expectations. James channeled his energy into useful pursuits, becoming Caleb's shadow during ranch operations and developing a remarkable affinity for horses. Rose, nearly 3, chattered constantly and had taken to calling Harriet Mama, without prompting or correction from anyone. In late June, a letter arrived from Mrs. Landry with an unexpected invitation. A regional agricultural fair would be held in Denver in July, with competitions for livestock that could significantly enhance a breeding operation's reputation. Several Pine Creek families planned to attend, and Mrs. Landry had secured rooms at a respectable hotel for those making the journey. "We should consider it," Harriet suggested over dinner, watching Caleb's reaction carefully. "The exposure could bring new clients for the yearling bulls." Caleb frowned slightly. "It's a 3-day ride each way, a week away from the ranch at minimum. Frank can manage things here, and your Hereford bull deserves to be seen beyond our valley." Caleb's expression remained troubled. "It's not the ranch I'm concerned about." He glanced meaningfully at the children, who were listening with interest. Harriet understood immediately. Since Catherine's death, Caleb had rarely taken the children far from home, as if the ranch's boundaries offered some invisible protection against further loss. "They could come with us," she said gently. "Emma's old enough for such a journey, and James and Rose would enjoy the adventure. "Can we, Papa?" Emma asked, her eyes lighting with excitement. Mrs. Landry said there would be music and shows and all sorts of things to see. Caleb's resistance visibly weakened at his daughter's enthusiasm. "We'd need to take the wagon, not ride. It would be slower, but more comfortable for the children," Harriet agreed, recognizing his implicit consent. "We could make it a proper family expedition." That night, as they lay together in what had become their shared bedroom, Caleb confessed fears he had never previously articulated. "After Catherine died, I couldn't bear the thought of something happening to the children while away from home," he said quietly, his arm tightening around Harriet's waist. "Foolish, I know. Safety is never guaranteed, here or elsewhere." "Not foolish," Harriet corrected, resting her head against his shoulder. "Grief makes us seek control wherever we can find it." "You make me brave enough to loosen that control," he admitted, "to let them experience more than just the boundaries of this ranch." Preparations for the Denver trip consumed the following weeks. Harriet altered dresses for herself and Emma, supervised the packing of appropriate clothing for the children, and worked with Caleb to select which animals to show. The prospect of returning to a city, even briefly, filled her with a mixture of anticipation and nostalgia for the life she had left behind in Boston. The journey to Denver passed more pleasantly than anticipated. Traveling by wagon allowed them to bring comforts that would have been impossible on horseback. Proper bedding for camping beneath star-filled skies, food supplies that supplemented what they hunted along the way, and small toys to keep the younger children entertained. Emma proved an excellent traveler, keeping a detailed journal of everything they saw. James treated each campsite as a new kingdom to explore, though he never strayed beyond the boundaries Caleb established. Even Rose maintained good spirits, content to bounce on Harriet's lap as the wagon rocked along primitive roads, singing improvised songs about cows and horses. Denver proved larger and more developed than Harriet had expected, with permanent buildings replacing the temporary structures of frontier settlements. The hotel Mrs. Landry had recommended was modest but clean, catering to respectable families conducting business in the growing city. Their arrival at the fairgrounds the next morning created an immediate stir. The Circle T's Hereford bull, a magnificent red and white animal with impressive conformation, drew attention even among the competitive array of livestock gathered for the event. "Thornton, thought that was your bull I spotted," a weathered man in a cattleman's hat approached, hand extended. "Samuel Garrett, formerly of Texas. You wouldn't remember me, but I never forgot those Herefords you started bringing north after the war." Caleb's posture changed subtly, a hint of pride entering his bearing as he shook the man's hand. "Good to see you again, Garrett." Garrett turned appreciative eyes toward the bull, which stood calmly despite the fair's commotion. "You've done well for yourself. This animal's got the perfect blend of size and hardiness." "English bloodlines on his sire's side," Caleb confirmed, "crossed with stock already adapted to mountain conditions." "Smart cross," Garrett nodded approvingly. "The Army's always looking for beef contractors who can deliver consistent quality. If your stock proves up to standard, we could discuss a standing contract." The conversation continued, drawing other breeders and potential buyers as word spread of the exceptional Hereford from the Circle T. Harriet watched with quiet satisfaction as Caleb's initial self-consciousness about having the children at such a public event gave way to evident pride when Emma intelligently answered a question about their calving percentages. The fair's first day concluded with the Circle T's bull earning a blue ribbon in his class, the judges praising his conformation and vigor. That evening, at a social gathering for participants, Harriet found herself approached by Mrs. Landry, who embraced her warmly. "My dear, you're positively glowing," the older woman observed. "Ranch life clearly agrees with you." "It's been challenging in ways I never anticipated," Harriet admitted. "But yes, I've found my place there." Mrs. Landry's knowing smile suggested she understood more than Harriet had said. "And what of your husband? I remember a man who barely spoke 2 words together when he came looking for a mail-order bride too old for town life." Harriet glanced across the room to where Caleb stood with the children, Rose perched on his hip as he pointed out decorations to her, his usual reticence tempered by genuine engagement with his family. "We've both adapted," she said simply. The second day of competition featured younger stock, with the Circle T's yearling bull taking first place in his class. More significantly, Caleb received several serious inquiries about purchasing breeding stock, including a tentative agreement with Garrett regarding Army supply contracts. That night, as they prepared for bed in their hotel room, the children, already asleep in the adjoining chamber, Caleb seemed preoccupied. "Garrett's offer could transform the Circle T," he said, removing his boots thoughtfully. "Regular Army contracts would provide stability through lean years." "It's a testament to what you've built," Harriet agreed, brushing out her hair before. "The small mirror." Caleb watched her in the mirror's reflection. "What we've built," he corrected quietly. "The Circle T is as much yours now as mine. I want you to know that." Harriet set down her brush, turning to face him. "Caleb," he approached, taking her hands in his. "I've been thinking about Stanton's visit, about vulnerabilities and protections." His scarred hand tightened around hers. "If anything happened, to me, I want to be certain you and the children would be secure. I've asked Judge Morrison to draw up papers making you a full legal partner in the ranch." The significance of this gesture wasn't lost on Harriet. In a time when married women had few property rights, Caleb was offering her a level of independence and security virtually unheard of. "Nothing is going to happen to you," she said firmly, though deeply touched by his concern. "Probably not," he agreed with the faintest smile, but a wise rancher plans for all contingencies. Their third and final day at the fair culminated in the awarding of the Grand Champion Ribbon, a prestigious recognition that could establish a breeding operations reputation throughout the territory. Against impressive competition from larger ranches, including Stanton's Bar S, the Circle T's Hereford Bull was selected as champion, validating Caleb's years of careful breeding decisions. As they journeyed home, their wagon now carrying not just a family, but ribbons and contracts that would secure their future, Harriet reflected on the strange path that had brought her here. 3 men had rejected her for being too old, yet in their short-sightedness they had guided her to Caleb Thornton, a man who valued the very wisdom her years had given her. Years later, the Circle T would become renowned throughout Colorado, not just for its exceptional cattle, but for the remarkable partnership between the mail-order bride deemed too old for frontier marriage and the widowed rancher who recognized that what she brought to his children, and to him, was precisely what they needed. Emma would grow up to manage the business side of the ranch, her mother's lessons in accounting and negotiation serving her well. James would eventually take over the breeding program, combining his father's instincts with his mother's methodical approach. And little Rose, who remembered no mother but Harriet, would become a teacher, carrying forward the legacy of learning her stepmother had instilled. As for Caleb and Harriet, they discovered that love found later in life often burns with a steadier, more enduring flame, tempered by experience and strengthened by shared purpose. Thank you for joining us for this heartfelt journey. If this story of finding value in life's wisdom touched you, please subscribe to our channel for more tales that remind us all that it's never too late to find where you truly belong. Tomorrow, we'll share another extraordinary story that proves sometimes life's rejections lead us exactly where we need to be.